Hi, welcome to Higher Rock Education. What if you were the only supplier of something everyone needed? Let's say electricity. Do you think you could jack up the price and people would still buy it? Probably. You have a monopoly. A monopoly is a market structure with a single seller offering a unique product. Do you think the quantity of electricity demanded would remain the same as you increase your price? No. People would conserve more. In the winter, they would lower their thermostat and perhaps wear an extra layer of clothing. They may even go as far as replacing their electric heat pump with a gas furnace. Monopoly power depends on the demand for a product, and the demand determines how much a monopoly will produce and how it will price its product. Let's consider the characteristics of a monopoly. A monopoly, by definition, has one producer. Normally, this is because of very, very high barriers to entry. A barrier to entry is an obstacle that impedes competitors from entering a market or industry. For example, it does not make economic sense for two electrical companies to serve most markets. Large economies of scale result in lower average costs as production is increased. Two or more electrical companies in an area would likely result in higher prices because the utility companies would have higher average costs than if one company served the area. Governments may grant a company a monopoly. This is the case when a patent is granted. For example, pharmaceutical companies may be given a patent for a drug that fights disease. No other company would be permitted to supply the same drug for the patent period, which is normally 10 years. Patents are granted to encourage development and innovation. Drugs are easily copied, so if a patent were not issued, there would be very little incentive for companies to spend enormous amounts of money for research and development of new drugs. A monopoly normally has few close substitutes. Gas for heating is a substitute for electricity, but most people would continue to use electricity for lighting and power. The availability of substitute reduces monopoly power. For example, the U.S. Postal Service's monopoly power has all but been eliminated in the past 30 years by technological advances that enable people to email or Skype each other. It's less expensive to telephone a friend today than it was 30 years ago. Competitors like UPS and Federal Express have helped hold down the costs of delivering packages. Internet companies, Skype, Verizon, AT&T, UPS, and Federal Express offer substitutes for the U.S. Postal Service. A monopoly has pricing power because it's the only producer of a good or service. It is a price maker because it sets its price by its desired output. This should become more apparent when we use some graphs to analyze how monopolies determine their price and output. A monopoly's demand curve is the industry demand curve because there's only one producer. It slopes downward, and its marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve because in order to increase sales, it must reduce the price of all the units it sells. Watch the video, Why the Marginal Revenue Curve is Below the Demand Curve, if you would like to learn more about why the marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve. Let's build a graph. We begin with a monopolist's demand and marginal revenue curves. If you have a monopoly, you can set your price where the quantity demanded equals your desired output. Perfectly competitive companies cannot do this. If they raise their price, they won't be able to sell any goods because they have so many competitors. This is also true of companies and industries that are oligopolies or monopolistic competition. Unlike other market structures, the monopolist can set the price to a level where it wants to produce because it's the only act in town. It's the only producer. Looking at our graph, if the monopoly wants to produce Q1, it can set its price at P1. If it wants to raise its price, it can, but it will have to settle for less output. Like all companies, the monopolist will produce where the marginal revenue equals its marginal cost. So I've added a marginal cost curve for our monopoly. The desired output is QM. What price has the monopolist set? Our demand curve provides the answer. Normally, we think of a demand curve as the number of goods and services that will be demanded at a given price. The monopolist looks at the demand curve a bit differently. Instead, the demand curve shows how much consumers are willing to pay at a given output. At output QM, consumers are willing to pay PM. Now, note that there is not a supply curve on our graph. A monopoly doesn't have a supply curve in the traditional sense. A supply curve is the amount a producer is willing to provide at a given price. The definition implies that a price is given and the producer responds to that price. Instead, as a price maker, the monopoly sets the price when it determines its desired output. In fact, the amount a monopoly is willing to supply depends on its demand curve. In competitive markets, the supply and demand curves are independent of each other. When combined, the equilibrium price and quantity are determined. The amount a monopolist is willing to supply is a function of its demand and marginal cost. A monopolist prices its goods or services higher and producers less than society views as optimal. Normally, economic profits encourage new businesses to enter the market. Production increases and the price falls. But unfortunately, the monopoly has no competition since high economic barriers prevent entry. So higher prices and less production would persist. Government regulation is common to prevent monopolies from exploiting their economic advantages.
To learn more, please visit our website for our free economics lessons at www.higherrockeducation.org. All our lessons include text, interactive exercises, review questions, and a related scripture lesson. Thank you.